Imagine taking your first breath, only to realize you are already on trial for your life. There is no mother's warmth waiting for you, only the cold, calloused hands of a government inspector. They check your tiny frame. If you're too small, if you cry too weakly, you don't go home. You are thrown into the abyss. This wasn't a horror movie concept. This was a factory inspection. Welcome to the ultimate machine of human engineering, where being born wasn't a gift, it was a survival test. And the passing grade was absolute perfection. This was the City of Iron, a living mechanism designed to strip away the softness of the soul until only a sharpened edge remained. While other civilizations built monuments of marble and gold, this one built monuments of bone and hidden strength. They existed behind the most formidable wall ever conceived, a wall made not of stone, but of men who had forgotten how to flinch. The world remembers them as the ultimate warriors, the legendary few who held the gates of fire. But the shadow cast by that glory is far longer and darker than the history books often dare to whisper. To understand the machine, one must understand how the parts were forged. It began at the apothetae, the place of rejection. Here, the state stepped between the parent and the child. If a newborn was deemed insufficient, the lineage ended there. The stories suggest they were left in the silence of the mountains, a sacrifice to the idea of a collective strength that could tolerate no weakness. This was the first lesson of the city. You do not belong to yourself. You are property of the state, and the state only keeps what it can use. Those who survived the first selection were not greeted with warmth, but with a calculated coldness. At the age of 7, the world of the home vanished. The boy was taken from his mother's side and thrust into the Agoge, a system of conditioning so rigorous it bordered on the surreal. The goal was not education in the sense of wisdom, but the systematic dismantling of the individual ego. They were given a single garment to wear year-round, regardless of the biting winter winds that swept through the valley. They were fed just enough to survive, but never enough to feel full, forced to learn the art of stealth and deception to supplement their rations. If they were caught stealing, they weren't punished for the act of taking. They were punished for the failure of being seen. It was a world where morality was secondary to efficiency, and where the only sin was being clumsy. In the dead of night, the young recruits were often forced to sleep on beds of reeds they had harvested with their bare hands from the riverbanks. To make these beds more durable, they were told to mix in thistledown, a sharp, irritating plant that ensured sleep was never deep, never truly restful. They were being taught that comfort was a lie, a poison that made the spirit heavy and the mind slow. The silence in the barracks was the silence of a predator waiting for the dawn. Every interaction, every meal, and every moment of rest was a competition. The elders watched from the shadows, inciting conflicts between the youths, waiting to see who would dominate and who would submit. They weren't looking for leaders. They were looking for the apex of the pack. They wanted boys who could endure the lash without a sound, boys who could march for miles on nothing but willpower. The Agoge was a furnace designed to burn away everything that was not essential to the state. There was no room for poetry, no time for the luxury of a personal opinion. The boys were taught to speak only when necessary, and even then, to use the fewest words possible. This brevity was not just a stylistic choice, it was a psychological defense. If you do not value your own thoughts, you cannot be manipulated by the thoughts of others. You become a vessel for the state's intent. By the time a youth reached his teenage years, the concept of mercy had been conditioned out of him. This was a necessary requirement for the darkest part of their societal structure, the secret police, the shadow wing of the military known as the Krypteia. The most promising young men were sent out into the countryside, armed with nothing but a small blade and their wits. Their mission was not to fight a foreign invader, but to terrorize the Helots, the enslaved population that outnumbered the citizens nearly 10 to 1. Under the cover of darkness, these young men would move through the fields and villages, silencing those who showed too much strength, too much intelligence, or too much spirit. It was a ritualized cycle of suppression, a way to ensure that the foundation of their economy, the labor of the broken, would never rise against the masters. This was the dark underbelly of the legend. The city was a fortress, but it was also a prison, and the guards were the very children who had been raised to know nothing but the cold steel of the state's requirements. The relationship between the warrior and the worker was one of absolute, simmering tension. The state lived in a permanent state of internal war. Every year, the leaders would formally declare war on the Helots, a legal maneuver that allowed them to maintain control through any means necessary without the stain of religious impurity. It was a society built on a volcanic fault line of human suffering, held together only by the sheer, terrifying discipline of the ruling class. They could not afford to be soft, because the moment they faltered, the sea of the oppressed would swallow them whole. Their legendary bravery was not born of a simple love for combat, but of a calculated necessity to be more frightening than the nightmare they lived within. They were a minority in their own land, and terror was their primary currency. When the training was complete, the individual had ceased to exist. In his place stood a part of the phalanx. This was the ultimate expression of their philosophy, a wall of bronze and muscle where no man stood alone. To step out of line was to invite the end of the entire unit. The shield was the most important piece of equipment, not because it protected the man who carried it, but because it protected the man standing to his left. To lose one's helmet or breastplate was a personal failure, but to lose one's shield was a crime against the state. The shield represented the collective, the unbreakable bond of the phalanx. If you returned from battle, you returned with your shield or on it. There was no middle ground. No room for the nuance of survival. You were either a functioning part of the machine or a broken piece to be discarded. This obsession with the collective extended into their very speech. They were the masters of the short, sharp, and biting phrase. They viewed words as they viewed soldiers. If they weren't necessary, they were a waste of resources. When an enemy threatened that their arrows would blot out the sun, the response was a simple, chilling indifference. Then we shall fight in the shade. This wasn't just bravado. It was the psychological defense mechanism of a people who had been taught from birth that their lives were the least important thing they possessed. They had been hollowed out and filled with the state's purpose, leaving no room for fear, because there was no self left to be afraid. They were ghosts in iron shells, waiting for the order to move. The women of this society were unlike any others in the ancient world, but their freedom came with a heavy, grim expectation. They were the gatekeepers of the lineage, the primary filters of the state's human resources. They were encouraged to exercise, to compete, and to be as physically formidable as the men, not for the sake of equality, but because it was believed that only strong mothers could produce the iron-willed sons the state required. Their role was to be the emotional anchor of this brutal system. A mother's parting words to her son weren't a prayer for his safety, but a command for his victory or his finality. The domestic sphere was not a sanctuary from the state. It was the primary reinforcement of it. Even in the privacy of the home, the machine never stopped grinding. But what happens to a culture that sacrifices everything for the art of the end? What remains when the only thing you have perfected is the ability to destroy and endure? They produced no great poets to sing of their deeds, no lasting architecture that didn't serve a military purpose, and no philosophy that didn't revolve around the utility of the group. They were a society frozen in a permanent state of readiness, a machine that could only function as long as there was an enemy to face or a population to suppress. The very discipline that made them invincible also made them brittle. Their numbers were always small, thinned by the very selection processes and high-stakes lifestyle they demanded. They were a flame that burned with an intense, terrifying brightness, but they lacked the fuel of innovation and human complexity to sustain it for more than a few centuries. The tragedy of the Iron City was its inability to change. As the world around them evolved, as new tactics were developed and new ideas took hold, they remained locked in the rituals of the past. Their population dwindled. The concentration of wealth into fewer hands and the dwindling number of equals meant that the machine was running out of parts. They had built a system so perfect and so rigid that it could not bend without breaking. When they finally met a force that could outthink their tactics and outmaneuver their rigid formations, the collapse was not just military, but existential. The wall of men finally flinched, and when it did, there was nothing behind it but the hollow echoes of a forgotten purpose. As the centuries passed, the world moved on. The City of Iron remained a relic of a specialized, brutal past. They became a tourist attraction for the Romans, a theme park of the old ways, where the once feared rituals were performed for the amusement of outsiders. The legendary warriors were reduced to performers, showing off their scars and their endurance to people who lived in a world of comfort they could never have imagined. It was a humiliating end for a people who had once claimed that their city needed no walls because its citizens were the stone. The iron had rusted and the bone had turned to dust, leaving behind only the stories of their terrifying dedication. The ultimate machine eventually ground itself to dust, leaving behind a chilling echo. We still tell stories of the 300 Spartans at the gates of fire, but we conveniently ignore the thousands of infants left to die in the cold, and the boys who were stripped of their humanity just to become a bronze shield for the state. It leaves us with a terrifying question. If a society survives by erasing everything that makes its people human, what exactly are they fighting to save? What do you think? Does extreme discipline forge the ultimate civilization, or just a brittle prison? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. If you want to unearth more declassified, dark history, hit that subscribe button and step deeper into the history ledger. Until next time, stay in the shadows.